Hello and welcome to another episode of the Peace Talk, this time with Professor Roger MacGinty. Roger MacGinty is a professor in defense, development and diplomacy at School of Government and International Affairs at Durham University. He works on peace and conflict, particularly on the intersection between top-down and bottom-up approaches of peacemaking. He co-directs the Everyday Peace Indicators project with Pamina Firchov and edits the Taylor and Francis journal Peace Building together with Oliver Richmond, which I also had the privilege to introduce on this program. He also edits the Rethinking Political Violence book series, and last but not least, he conducted extensive fieldwork, and his research has been funded by the European Union and Carnegie Corporation of New York, among others. And among his publication, Roger published a book 3 years ago on everyday peace, how so-called ordinary people can disrupt violent conflicts. And also a great publication is an international peace building and local resistance hybrid form of peace from 2011. Dear Roger, it's a great honor and pleasure that you followed my invitation for this peace talk.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you.
Thanks to David Schoing from the scientific journal Wissenschaft und Frieden, Science and Peace, we have the following questions prepared. So let me begin with the first one. You have strongly criticized the liberal peace model, also together with Oliver Richmond. And then you introduced also your concept of everyday peace. Before we move on to the concept, please explain us what is the critique, what is your main critique of the liberal peace model?
I think there are a number of critiques can be leveled against it. Fundamentally, it doesn't work. There are a lot of other critiques that say that it is top-down, that it fails to take adequate attention of local dynamics, that it is foisting Western values onto non-Western places, and largely that it uses the language of liberalism but does not actually mean it. Often there is a critique that it is an illiberal peace, that it is democracy at gunpoint, that it uses a thin veneer of liberalism or a narration of liberalism, but doesn't actually follow through. And what we see in a lot of liberal peace instances are actually hollow states or shell states in which there is political agreement with a small coterie of leaders in the capital city, but that does not extend beyond that. I should say, of course, the liberal peace is over and it's not coming back. This is something that we saw in the last years of the last century and then in the first decade or so of this century. But really, we've seen a withdrawal from the liberal peace by those champions of the liberal peace in that time period. The US, the UK, the EU, they no longer talk about democracy or human rights. They don't use the language of liberalism anymore. They use the language of security and stabilization.
If we want to trace it back, when did it begin? With the Bretton Woods system, or later, or before that, or how does it begin?
That's a really great question, and I think, to be perfectly honest, we can trace it back to colonialism. We can trace it back to a set of assumptions. And the key assumption is that states in the global north have the right to intervene in other states. And that set of assumptions has carried through over centuries and decades. And not only is it the assumption of Western states or Western-led international organizations have the right to intervene, it's also the assumption that they know how to intervene and what form of governance is best. So, when we think about, for example, the Western intervention in Afghanistan in 2001. It didn't begin in 2001. It began in the 19th century when the assumption that Afghanistan was a space waiting for intervention, needing intervention, took root. And, you know, it was quite instructive. One of the British military bases, forward operating bases in Afghanistan 20 years ago, was named after a colonial soldier who was involved in Afghan wars in the 19th century. And to me, that just showed or told us something about the continuity of assumptions. Uh, you're right, of course, the liberal peace was increasingly codified after the Second World War with international structures, and it really peaked or reached its zenith in the last years of the last century and the early years of this century. And there are still remnants of the liberal peace left, but it's over. It's not coming back in the same way that it was.
Interesting analysis. And from a global south perspective, we saw that the International Criminal Court, for the first time in its history, condemned, so to speak, Western ally. And before that, it only criticized, so to speak, African leaders or from the global south leaders. So maybe, yeah, this is also a sign that the liberal model is over, or the Western hegemony is crumbling. Maybe.
Absolutely. Yeah. We're seeing a fragmentation of the rules-based international order, as was. We're seeing a fragmentation of international organizations and the consensus upon which they operate. Peace, to the extent that it has worked over the past 50 years, has worked when the United Nations Security Council acted in concert. At the minute, it's a deeply dysfunctional organization. There is no consensus. There's the use of the veto, or indeed states don't bother bringing things to the P5 because they know nothing will pass, or things won't pass. So we're seeing the fragmentation of that rules-based international order. We're seeing apparently new or newly visible peace actors on the stage. You know, if we look at Ukraine, the actors who are negotiating prisoner exchanges, who are talking about ceasefires, or from the Gulf states or China and Brazil, or 2 summers ago we had the African Peace Mission. So there are interesting things happening globally in relation to peace. And one of the parts of that is the fragmentation of that liberal rules-based international order.
Absolutely, and of course we can add many other stories as well. American exceptionalism, the so-called Bush doctrine's responsibility to protect preemptive strikes, and many other things that are violating of obviously the international rules of law, and many others. And today it's quite interesting. Also, Putin framed it as a special military operation. So I have the impression that nowadays nobody does war. Wars doesn't exist any longer. So it's quite funny how they framed it, and yeah. But let's put the hypocrisy aside. Let's dig deeper into your concept. So, having said all that, and criticizing the liberal peace model, what is your offer? You're offering the concept of everyday peace. So, for the audience that didn't read your books, could you summarize what is the key elements of this concept?
The key element is a recognition that peace is a verb as well as a noun. And that means that it is made and remade by people on the ground. And a lot of the literature on peace and peacemaking pays a lot of attention to states And that's okay because states have a lot of power. States can mobilize military forces and economic sanctions and occupy the diplomatic space. But really, in societies that are experiencing anything between peace and conflict, it's people on the ground who have to navigate through everyday life. They have to send the kids to school. They have to put food on the table. They have to get medicine for a sick relative. They have to get on with life. And the notion of everyday peace is really looking at that everyday agency. That's where people live. That's where peace is made. It's lived in apartment blocks, in communities, it's in workplaces, it's in everyday life. I'm not laboring under any illusions that states don't matter, that states cannot create security and insecurity for people. But what I am doing is trying to recenter a lot of our studies onto people and communities. Because let's face it, that's where we all live. That's the life that we experience. And therefore, that makes us question, or at least look at, the quality of peace. I think there was an assumption in the 1990s and early part of this century that if peace accords were reached at the elite level, somehow peace would filter down like fairy dust, or like trickle down economics being replaced by trickle down peace. Well, that didn't happen. Um, and I think what we need to do is look at those spaces that communities and individuals can carve out for themselves.
You touched upon it, but let's dig deeper into this question. As states do still leverage disproportionate amount of power, and they also they excessively it's demonstrated in China or many other regions in the world, and with regards to decisions of global war, who can decide to make a war, and in regard of conflict and peace, how does everyday peace help in transforming the global peace architecture? If we keep in mind that the US is spending I believe $1 trillion for the military spending, and China and Russia, they increase their military spending, and I believe they are trying to modernize their nuclear arsenal. So having said all that, it seems like utopia, or critics can say, why does it matter?
I mean, that's a good point, and I take it seriously. I think the important point is that we need to take people seriously, we need to take their agency seriously, and we need to ask ourselves, why do we take states so seriously? Really, look around the world. Many of those leaders or presidents elect are patently absurdist characters. They are people with extraordinarily flawed personalities. Often, looking around the world, they are authoritarian. They have their mandate through stolen elections or no elections. And I think that we, as both as citizens but also as scholars, really have to ask ourselves, why do we take these people so seriously? Why do we give them legitimacy? Now, I'm not saying that they don't have the power to sanction us, they don't have the power to discipline us. Of course they do. They control militaries. But it's worth asking this question, why do we take these frankly ridiculous characters so seriously? The other point to make is that, uh, again, it's worth trying to recenter a lot of our studies on people and communities, because that's where people live, that's where peace is made and remade and threatened. And I think that although states have a lot of power, they also have very many blind spots. If we look at many conflict affected societies, actually what's at heart in the conflict is an imperfect, ongoing state building exercise in which the state, whether it's Afghanistan or Syria or Colombia or Yemen or many, many other places, the state has failed to extend its authority and its legitimacy across the territory. And within those spaces, which are either ungoverned or episodically governed or poorly governed, people have to make their own lives. They have to put food on the table, get the kids to school, etc. And within those spaces and between those individuals and those communities, people are fashioning forms of modernity, forms of exchange, forms of life. And I think it's remiss of us as scholars if we don't take that seriously. But I think also as scholars, we need to have this multipolar, transscalar lens in which we can see everything in a way that we're not missing out important parts of the evidential trail. And I'm not dismissing states or geopolitics. States have the immense ability to kill large amounts of people. And they also have the immense ability to save and improve the lives of large amounts of people. Perhaps the most significant thing that states can do is to invest in public health systems, to invest in sanitation. That very mundane action saves our species from a lot of disease and preventable death. So we have to take all levels of the system seriously. But I think we need to rebalance a lot of our studies and focus on people and communities and raise our eyebrows in a quizzical way at a lot of these absurdist leaders. As we're talking, yesterday, President Assad of Syria was ousted. He was a ridiculous character. He was a mildly spoken, well-dressed eye doctor who trained and worked in London. Yet he was also a ferocious dictator, absurd character, who probably got, in fact, very much did get much more respect from other leaders and other media organizations than he deserved.
Now you touched upon the Syrian question. How can we you said that we should take local voices and local peace actors serious. Now we saw the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS. They overthrow their dictator. But is there any principles or guideline how to prevent that local gathering or opposition is turning 180 degrees around and is becoming that what it should fight. So the Islamists, so-called rebels or terrorists in the opinion of the US government, for example, should we call it a legitimate protest? Should we call it a local peace actor? So it's how we should analyze this, because you rightly said, okay, he's a dictator, we overthrow him, but now what?
It's a fabulous question, and I think lots of governments are scrambling to address that now what question. I would say a number of things. One, it's interesting that regime change has happened in Syria, and as far as we know, it's largely Syrian people who have made that happen. Obviously, it's within a regional and international context, but largely this seems to be a Syrian uprising. That's really interesting because with previous regime changes, there's been a sense that Western governments have then taken charge. We're in charge. We will establish an interim government. We will set the rules. Oh, look, here's a constitution that we have prepared for you. So that's one interesting part of the Syrian story. Another really interesting part is just the sheer fragmentation that we're seeing in Syria. We've seen it for a long time, the fragmentation of very many bodies, very many armed groups and factions who have external sponsors, often external sponsors that are diametrically opposed to one another. I think one organization that we haven't heard of in media commentary on Syria over the past few days is the United Nations. And the United Nations is precisely the body that is established for purposes like this. It is precisely the body that is there to preserve security, international security, to work for peace. And it has the tools at its disposal. It has immense experience. And, whilst we might focus on the sort of peacekeeping or peacemaking or peace building tools, let's not forget the enormous social and economic tools the UN also can mobilize in terms of the World Food Programme and agencies linked to refugees and mobility, etc., etc. So I think this is a moment, and it's very interesting that the United Nations, which is merely the sum of its parts, isn't being discussed. And I think part of that is because of a very deliberate strategy by many states, particularly leading states, to downplay and undercut the United Nations. I mean, I'm probably not unusual in that I have to pause for a second to think of the name of the UN Secretary General. In previous eras, we didn't have to do that because the UN and the Secretary General were actually major players on the international stage. We're not seeing that anymore. So it's as I saw someone from Syria say on social media, this is a time for immense celebration, but we're fearful about what might happen in the future. And I think all other governments are in a similar position. The speed of this took many by surprise, and it's yet another major geopolitical change that has taken the multi-billion dollars CIA by surprise. And no doubt they will go to their government and ask for more money because that's what they do after every one of their failures.
Absolutely interesting, yes. In your chapter, together in the introduction, together with Oliver Richmond, you wrote on legitimacy and peace in the age of interventions. And there you mentioned the UN capstone doctrine pointed on how legitimacy for peace operations should be presented in the eyes of local population. And many other things. So let's highlight why is legitimacy so important for the peace studies or for local actors.
Yeah, I think it's crucial because it really is the difference between success and failure. It's the difference between something being sustained, and one of the key phrases from the United Nations is sustainable peace. The difference between peace being sustained and not sustained. And that's because of the importance that communities and populations have buy-in, that they're with the program, that they believe in it. Now, I'm not entirely sure that Western liberal democracy means of achieving legitimacy work everywhere else. We've seen that is problematic, and there are all sorts of debates over the universalism or supposed universalism of Western notions. But we do need some sort of mechanisms in which we can accurately gauge the extent to which populations have buy-in with forms of governance. And we may need forms of evaluation, methods of evaluation that can test the extent to which governments or governing authorities are delivering on fairly basic responsibilities of states linked to public goods. I think The difficulty with somewhere like Syria is that there are multiple parties at play in Syria with multiple sponsors, in the modern language, stakeholders, and that raises all sorts of questions. It's also in an extremely sensitive region. It does not have the best neighbors. You would not wish to have that set of neighbors on your doorstep. And it's a very tense region. So I think a big challenge facing international actors is to work out what legitimacy might look like, how it might be gauged, and how it might be tracked on an ongoing basis. Now, in the liberal peace model, that method was parliamentary or presidential elections. Syria has a history of elections, but of course those elections were rigged. With Assad miraculously being the only candidate allowed to stand. So then to go to the Syrian population and say we're going to have elections, you would not be surprised if that population had a deep suspicion of that method of gauging legitimacy. So I think there is a lot of work to be done to think of alternative ways of gauging legitimacy, but it's absolutely crucial to sustaining popular buy-in in peace or situations that are approximating to peace.
And also we can add the dimension of the liberal peace, which they always repeat, is the free market. So the capitalist way of production and consumption, it's also a key element of this. And yeah. The result, we see it even in the Western rich societies, is the gap between the poor and the rich is growing and growing. So yeah, there is an underlining concept of peace which is broader and much more than the absence of war. So peace means a lot more than not fighting or war.
Very much so, and clearly it's not a binary of war on the one side, peace on the other. I think we have to think about a contested space, an agonistic space that is oscillating between forms of war and forms of peace. It's a non-linear space in which populations can be peaceful in intention and action on one issue and less peaceful in terms of intention and action on another issue. And they can hold those views simultaneously. So they communities might make peace, two main communities might make peace with one another, but there still may be huge discrimination against a minority, against a small minority, or there may be racism. So for example, post-apartheid South Africa is a space of enormous discrimination against migrants from Zimbabwe, for example. Or where I am at the moment, I'm in Northern Ireland, in which we've had a major peace accord a generation ago, which was largely transformative, but there's still hate crime against minorities and incoming populations. So I think we have to reevaluate notions of peace to take on board its complexity, its non-linearity, its transscalar nature, and the fact that it's dynamic. It's a verb as well as a noun, so it changes all of the time. It's constantly in flux.
Let's go back to my initial question and to the concept of everyday peace. In what ways can everyday small strategic peace interactions build peace amongst the structures of violence, structure of observation and surveillance and in hostile environment? Maybe also I can add the question, can you give for examples of this? Because a somewhat similar approach of, so to speak, the weapons of the weak has been brought forward by the anthropologist and anarchist James C. Scott a few years ago. And in a close reading, some have warned against overstating the means and possibilities of the local to change the conflict dynamics, and also against a certain romanticization, so to speak, of the local. So, how, on one hand, do we avoid or navigate these challenges? And how? I know it's a lot, but
I think those cautions are very, very valid, and we shouldn't see resistance where there is not resistance. We need to be quite cautious. I see everyday peace as often acting on the margins, outside of surveillance, because those are the spaces that it operates in. I think what it can do is civilize interpersonal and intercommunity relations. It can create small spaces of humanity, of mercy, of sympathy and empathy, and that is a good thing. It's probably not going to topple regimes or stop wars at a strategic level, but what it can do is save and improve lives. So in terms of examples, I'm reminded of lots of autobiographies from very, very many wars in which people made decisions not to shoot the person in front of them, but to take them prisoner, or to get medical aid for their enemy. Now, none of these actions changed the course of a war, but they saved lives. You know, people survived imprisonment and were repatriated and went on to live lengthy lives and have families and otherwise productive lives. To me, that is important. That is a bottom-up IHL. It's making peace in spaces of war. And it's also, and this is really important, it's puncturing the notion that everyone who lives in a particular state is the same, or everyone in a particular military or militia group or political party is the same. It punctures that notion of the hegemonic narrative in which the political leader says, I speak for everyone. Well, no, they don't, because there is dissent, there is space for micro resistance, there is space for people to hang back and observe. So I think there are these little spaces where everyday peace can be made. It can make a difference, certainly at the level of the micro, and that's, to me, is quite crucial, both in real time, but looking back and thinking optimistically about conflicts that are ongoing at the moment.
absolutely, it sounds convincing. Let's move on to my last question. Despite it's a tough question because many say in a Cold War 2.0, or others analyzed it as maybe a coming block confrontation, or even third World War. So and when we see Libya, Lebanon, Syria, Ukraine, Gaza, there are many in Africa and many other conflicts. So it's a tough question, but what transformative hopes for the future of conflict transformation and peace building do you have?
As I mentioned earlier, we're in this era of flux. We're in an era in which the guide rails of peacemaking have changed very much. And actually, I'm not entirely sure that we have guide rails. So things to be hopeful about in the future need to overcome major barriers, not least the dysfunctionality of the UN Security Council. One major thing that would change geopolitically would be some sort of accommodation between the United States and China to make the P5 work again, to make the UN Security Council work again. But I'm not entirely hopeful that that would happen. But I think we do have to be hopeful when we look at the prisoner exchanges and ceasefire talks that are being mediated by Gulf states. The UAE is involved so regularly in prisoner exchanges between Russia and the Ukraine that these exchanges are happening on a monthly basis, and they're happening at scale in terms of the number of prisoners. I think a greater awareness amongst people about climate change is actually a sign of optimism. Clearly, we've had yet another cop out from the cop. But I think that the level of activism oscillates, but at the same time, I think the impending crisis means that the new generation, the new tech-savvy generation, is on the case. And I think as well, digital technologies are quite helpful, particularly in facilitating everyday peace, in allowing people to see that not everyone on the other side is a monster, that not everyone in the same group is the same. It allows us to see difference within groups, and that is quite a good thing. And also, I think in terms of optimism for the future, we're seeing the African Peace Mission, we're seeing Brazil as a peacemaker, we're seeing these apparently new, or at least newly visible actors coming on stage. They're not going to go away. Now, they pose very considerable questions for those established peace actors who want to know, well, what's the ideology behind moves towards peace by Qatar or by those African states? But at the same time, what it's doing is it's showing us that there is a multiplicity of peace possibilities. And this is largely happening in the vacuum that we see given the withdrawal of Western states from this peace space. So this is an unfolding story. We don't know where it's going to go, but frankly, the liberal peace was very dysfunctional, and these replacement pieces are moving into that space. So this is going to be a space of contention, but hopefully of productive negotiation in the coming decade or so.
And do you see any also hope or potential for transformation for the United Nations? I heard some weeks ago an African scholar who demanded that the veto mechanism should be transformed, and also African nations or Africa as a continent should sit on the table, and not only for the UN, it's also for the World Bank and many other institutions that are important. So maybe do you see here in this regard any hope, or can we transform the United Nations so that it has legitimacy for everybody? And
I don't see that happening in the short term, simply because those members of the club are jealously guarding their privilege. Unfortunately, it may take a major international shock and a rebuilding of an international system to bring that change. But it's certainly increasingly untenable that some countries with massive populations are not represented. Entire continents are not represented when declining states, Britain and France being obvious examples, are retaining their place on the UN Security Council because of the outcome of a war that was won many generations ago. So I think that's increasingly untenable, and people know about this. So it's an issue that isn't going to go away. Unfortunately, it may need a shock to deliver real change.
And you stated that the liberal peace model is aspired, so to speak. So it's not working any longer, and it doesn't exist any longer. What is the alternative, or do we see that? But because many scholars are saying that maybe the BRICS formation is some sort of challenging the liberal world order, and they frame it like multipolarity. So do you see the multipolar world order as a replacement, or is it a challenge for hegemony for world order? Or yeah, and what are here the hopes or ambiguities or challenges?
We're living in the alternative. We're living in the post-liberal peace era, and it is made up of a number of competing and sometimes cooperating elements. So we have the remnants. The legacy of the liberal peace is still with us. We have the UN, as we've just mentioned. We've still have summitry in terms of states meeting one another. We still have a body of international humanitarian law. So we have the remnants of the liberal peace, but we have these new or apparently new or newly visible or more visible actors coming along, whether it's a very assertive China or other states in the BRICS. We have multipolarity mixed with a balance, an old-fashioned balance of power. And we're in that situation, I think, of states trying to strive for some sort of balance or working out what the rules of that balance are. And we can see with a number of ongoing conflicts how those conflicts, whether it's Gaza or Myanmar or major issues such as climate change, are threatening that balance. And states are working out the tension points and the choke points of this balance. So we're truly living in an era of flux and uncertainty, but we're in this era of replacement of the liberal peace. It's gone. It's not coming back. Remnants are still there from it, but we're working out even what to call this era that we're in. At least we could call the Cold War during the Cold War. This feels like something different from post-Cold War. I think we've moved to a new era, but someone has to coin a phrase for it.
Yeah. Dear Roger, it was a great pleasure. I learned a lot from your books and articles, and I enjoyed the talk, and I thank you very much that you took your time, and yeah, it was an honor.
Well, thank you very much, Joseph. I'm very grateful for the chance, because I think we're all students at the moment trying to work out what